There are voices that seem to belong to everyone at once, warm, worn, and familiar, like they've been playing in the background of your whole life. Kenny Rogers had one of those voices. For more than 5 decades, he filled radios, jukeboxes, and living rooms with songs that felt like they understood exactly what you were going through. He sold well over 100 million records, earned Grammys, and became one of the most beloved entertainers America ever produced. But the man behind that golden voice carried a story far more complicated than his easy Sunday afternoon charm suggested. Behind the fame were 5 marriages, painful family estrangements, financial battles fought long after he'd already made his fortune, and a childhood shaped by poverty most fans never knew about. And in his final years, Kenny Rogers quietly stepped away from the world, choosing to spend his last chapter not in stadiums, but in the quiet company of the people and small comforts he loved most. This is the story of how he got there, and how his extraordinary life came to its close. Kenneth Ray Rogers was born on August 21st, 1938, in Houston, Texas, the 4th of 8 children. His mother worked long hours as a nurse's aide, and his father took whatever carpentry jobs he could find to keep the family afloat. Money was scarce. The Rogers family lived in a housing project on the edge of downtown Houston, in a neighborhood where survival was a daily task rather than a given. Kenny later admitted that meals weren't always guaranteed, and that peanut butter sandwiches were a staple simply because they were affordable and filling. He didn't consider his situation unusual at the time. Most of the families around him were scraping by in similar fashion, and there was a sense of shared struggle that bonded the neighborhood together rather than dividing it. Despite the hardship, education mattered in the Rogers household, and Kenny became the first person in his family to graduate high school, finishing in 1956. Before that milestone, though, he was already working, sweeping floors in a hat shop for a few dollars a week, and later bussing tables at one of Houston's grand old hotels. Somewhere between those odd jobs, music found him. He won a local talent competition as a boy, a small victory that planted the first seed of a much bigger dream. It would take years, false starts, and a fair amount of rejection before that dream became a career. His father struggled with alcohol, a fact that shaped Kenny more than he often let on publicly. He rarely touched alcohol himself throughout his life, driven by a quiet fear that addiction might run his blood the same way it had taken hold of his father. In interviews later in life, he expressed real regret that he never fully understood what his father had been going through. The shame of unemployment after World War II, the way to fail and provide, and the drinking that followed. That unresolved sadness stayed with him long after his father passed away, and friends say it quietly shaped the compassion Kenny showed toward people battling their own private struggles, whether it was addiction, poverty, or simple bad luck. Kenny's musical path in his 20s was anything but smooth. He tried his hand as a solo singer in the late 1950s with little success, then joined a jazz trio that built a small but devoted following and even landed a recording contract, only for the group to dissolve a few years later. Another solo attempt in the mid-1960s also failed to catch on. In between these efforts, he worked behind the scenes as a session musician and songwriter, contributing to other artists' recordings and slowly building a reputation within the industry, even as his own name struggled to break through. A folk revival group gave him his next opportunity, but it was leaving that group in 1967 to help form a new band that finally changed his fortunes. The new act blended folk, rock, and a psychedelic edge that was unusual for its time, and their breakout single became an unexpected hit, eventually finding a strange second life decades later, when it was featured memorably in a cult film. The band shifted gradually toward a country sound as the years went on, and Kenny slowly emerged as his most recognizable voice. By the mid-1970s, though, internal tensions and shifting musical tastes brought the group to an end. Going solo again in his late 30s should have been daunting, and in many ways it was. Record executives openly told him he was too old to make it in country music, a genre that at the time favored much younger performers. Kenny kept performing anyway, working small venues and building relationships with people who believed in him even when labels didn't. One such supporter, a Las Vegas venue owner, famously pushed him to think bigger rather than settle for a modest, comfortable career. That encouragement, paired with a partnership with producer Larry Butler, finally paid off. Their collaboration produced a song that became an enormous hit and earned Kenny his first Grammy Award, a turning point he never stopped being grateful for. Once his solo career took off, it never really slowed down. Kenny Rogers became one of the defining voices of the late 1970s and 1980s, crossing effortlessly between country and pop audiences in a way few artists managed. He racked up dozens of top 40 hits, and songs like Lady and his unforgettable duet with Dolly Parton became staples of American radio. His 1978 story song about a gambler's wisdom became so iconic that it spawned an entire series of television movies, with Kenny reprising the lead role and earning an Emmy nomination along the way. His catalog would later be recognized among the most influential in country music history. And in the mid-1980s, national polls named him the country's favorite singer. Music wasn't his only outlet. He acted in films and television, dabbled in photography as a creative escape between tour dates, and ventured into business, co-founding a rotisserie chicken restaurant chain alongside a former fast food executive in the early 1990s. The chain found early buzz, even earning a mention on a wildly popular sitcom of the era, but a costly lawsuit and fierce competition from established fast food giants eventually caught up with it. The U.S. locations closed within a few years, though surprisingly, the brand found lasting popularity overseas, particularly across Southeast Asia, where it still operates today. Kenny kept recording new music well into his 70s, releasing an album in 2006 that reached the upper tiers of both the country and all-genre album charts. He toured relentlessly for decades, only formally stepping off the road for good around 2017, closing out a performing career that spanned more than 60 years and touched nearly every corner of American popular music. Kenny's personal life was far less steady than his professional rise. He married 5 times, becoming a father to 5 children along the way. His first marriage came when he was barely out of his teens, following the birth of his daughter, and it ended within 2 years. A second marriage collapsed almost as quickly. A third lasted over a decade and produced a son, ending in the mid-1970s. His fourth marriage, to actress Marianne Gordon, lasted the longest of his early unions, 16 years, and gave him a son he remained close to for the rest of his life. That marriage's end came with a significant financial settlement and, by Marianne's own later account, stemmed partly from Kenny's restlessness as his career pulled at him and a sense that time was slipping away. In his 2012 memoir, Kenny was unusually candid about these failures, taking responsibility rather than deflecting blame. He acknowledged that his drive and self-focus during those years had cost him relationships he had genuinely valued, and he never pretended the fault lay solely with the women he'd married. It was a rare moment of public vulnerability from a man whose stage persona was so steady and reassuring. His fifth and final marriage, to Wanda Miller in 1997, proved to be the one that lasted. The couple faced early skepticism, in part because of their considerable age gap. Wanda was nearly 3 decades younger, closer in age to Kenny's own adult children than to Kenny himself. Over time, that skepticism faded as the relationship proved durable. The couple welcomed twin sons in 2004, a decision Kenny later admitted he'd been hesitant about, worried that his age would prevent him from being present for major milestones in his sons' lives. That worry never fully left him, but he spoke often of how fulfilling it was to raise his younger boys, even as he expressed quiet regret about the time he'd missed with his older children during the busiest, most demanding years of his career. 2 relationships outside his marriages left a lasting mark on Kenny's life. His decades-long friendship with Dolly Parton became one of the most enduring and beloved partnerships in music history. Both had grown up with very little, and that shared understanding of hardship formed the foundation of a bond that outlasted trends, rumors, and the passage of time. Their signature duet became a defining song of the era, and their genuine camaraderie on stage and off endeared both of them to generations of fans. His friendship with singer Dottie West was equally significant, built on shared musical chemistry and mutual loyalty. When West faced serious financial and personal setbacks in the early 1990s, Kenny quietly stepped in to help, including gifting her a car during a difficult stretch. Tragically, that same car was involved in the accident that led to her death in 1991, after a breakdown forced her to accept a ride from a neighbor on the way to a performance. Her death devastated Kenny, and for years afterward he campaigned for her posthumous recognition, hoping to see her formally honored for her contributions to country music. That recognition finally came in 2018, and Kenny made sure to publicly celebrate the moment in her memory. Even legends, it turns out, aren't immune to being shortchanged. In the early 2010s, Kenny joined a wave of prominent musicians taking legal action against major record labels over unpaid royalties from digital music sales. As platforms like iTunes reshaped how music was bought and sold, artists argued they were entitled to a much larger share of the revenue than labels were actually paying out. Kenny's case centered on a substantial sum he believed he was owed from digital downloads of his own catalog. He wasn't alone. Several other well-known artists filed similar claims around the same time, and the disputes exposed a broader pattern within the industry that continued to draw scrutiny for years afterward, well into the streaming era. Away from courtrooms, contracts, and concert stages, Kenny built a quieter life at his estate in rural Georgia. It was there that he found an unlikely source of comfort in his later years, a pet goat he'd acquired from a friend in the late 2000s. He spoke fondly of how the animal helped ground him after the exhaustion of touring, offering a strange but genuine sense of calm that fame rarely could. It was a small, almost whimsical detail in an otherwise larger-than-life story, but it captured something true about Kenny, a man who, despite decades in the spotlight, still found his deepest peace in simple things. By the mid-2010s, Kenny's health had begun to decline, and the physical demands of touring were taking a visible toll. He announced a farewell tour, determined to give his fans one last proper goodbye, but by 2018, he could no longer finish it. His team eventually confirmed that he had been hospitalized for dehydration, and though the statement expressed hope for his continued recovery, it was clear that the grueling schedule of live performance was no longer sustainable for a man in his 80s. He formally retired from touring, choosing instead to spend his remaining time with his wife and his young sons, a decision he had been easing toward for years as his mobility worsened and his priorities shifted toward family. Those final years were lived largely out of the public eye. Friends and family described a man who remained sharp, warm, and quick with a joke even as his body slowed down. He continued to enjoy simple pleasures, time on his farm, moments with his twin boys, an occasional visit from family members who cherished the chance to see him not as a music legend, but simply as a brother, a father, and a husband. On March 20th, 2020, Kenny Rogers passed away peacefully at his home in Georgia, surrounded by his wife and children, under hospice care. He was 81 years old. His family confirmed that he died of natural causes, closing out a life defined by extraordinary highs and deeply human struggles in equal measure. Because his death coincided with the early, chaotic weeks of a global pandemic, his family made the difficult decision to forego a large public funeral, instead opting for a small private service and promising fans that a proper public celebration of his life would come once circumstances allowed. The tributes that followed were immediate and heartfelt. Longtime friends and collaborators spoke of the laughter, generosity, and quiet loyalty that defined him behind the scenes. At the following year's Grammy Awards, his memory was honored during the annual tribute to artists who had passed, with a performance dedicated to one of his most beloved ballads. Fellow musicians who had shared stages and studios with him described losing not just a colleague, but one of their closest friends. A year after his death, Kenny's family and team released a public message thanking fans for their support through an incredibly difficult year, acknowledging that some days remain harder than others, but that the outpouring of love from admirers around the world had helped carry them through. They spoke of a grief that hadn't faded, but had softened into something gentler, a mix of tears and genuinely fond memories, a presence that still felt close even in his absence. His sister later helped produce a documentary chronicling his life.